After spending nearly an hour throwing up until she no longer had the strength to stand, Myra slowly slid down the cold bathroom wall and stared at her phone with trembling hands. There were dozens of contacts. Friends, relatives, neighbors. Yet not a single person she could call and say, "Can you please take me to the hospital?" Her parents were exactly where they had always been whenever she needed them, putting her older brother, Marcus, first. For the first time in her life, she stopped asking herself why. Instead, she asked herself a different question. What if I simply left? The thought refused to leave her mind. Hours later, after the dizziness had finally faded, she walked into her bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out a small blue suitcase. She packed only the things she could never replace. A few clothes, her passport, the handwritten baking recipes her Aunt Odetta had treasured for years. Nothing else. Then she sat at the dining table, stared at a blank sheet of paper for several minutes, and wrote just one sentence. "I'm safe. Please don't look for me." She added the date, folded the note once, placed it beneath the sugar bowl so no one could miss it. Then, without telling a single soul where she was going, she quietly locked the front door behind her and disappeared. She believed she was leaving behind a family that had spent 9 summers making her feel like she never truly belonged. She had no idea that boarding a flight to Seoul, South Korea, would change the course of her life forever. If you think this story is about revenge, you're about to be very, very wrong. So grab your favorite snack, get comfortable, and don't forget to subscribe to Afro-Korean Romance Archive, because this is the unforgettable story of Myra, the forgotten daughter who found love, family, and a future where she was finally someone's first choice. Myra lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, 3 miles from the hospital where she worked as a billing clerk. She was 27 years old. She had lived in that apartment for 4 years, and in that time, not one member of her family had ever visited. On a Tuesday night in March, she stood in her kitchen making tea when her stomach turned. Within minutes, she was on her knees in front of the toilet, her body rejecting everything she had eaten that day. She stayed there for nearly an hour, sweat soaking through her shirt, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She scrolled through her contacts. Mom, Dad, Marcus, Aunt Odetta, Denise from work, Pastor Williams. Her thumb hovered over her mother's name. She pictured the phone ringing. She pictured her mother glancing at the screen, then setting the phone down because Marcus needed something. Marcus always needed something. Marcus had needed something for 31 years. She put the phone down without calling anyone. She crawled to the bathroom wall and pressed her back against the cold tile, and for the first time in her life, she let herself ask the real question. Why do I keep waiting for people who were never coming? Her chest heaved, not from sickness this time, from something else, something that had been sitting in her ribs since she was 8 years old. She remembered the summer she turned 8. Her parents had stood in the driveway with 2 suitcases, one for Marcus, one for their carry-on, while her small blue suitcase sat by the porch steps. Her mother had knelt down and smoothed Myra's hair and said, "You understand, don't you, baby? Marcus almost died. We have to give him these years." Myra had nodded because she was 8 and nodding was easier than crying. She thought of the summer she turned 12, sitting in her aunt's bakery in Rock Hill, South Carolina, watching her aunt pull sourdough from the oven while her parents posted pictures from a resort in the Bahamas. Marcus grinning next to a dolphin, her mother in a sun hat. Not one photo asked where Myra was. She thought of the summer she turned 16, the last one, when she finally asked her father directly why she never got a vacation. "You're the strong one," he had said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "Marcus needs us. You don't." 9 summers. 9 years of a small blue suitcase carried to her aunt's porch. 9 years of learning that her worth was measured by how little she needed instead of how much she deserved. She remembered one summer more clearly than the others, the summer she turned 14. She had begged her mother, just once, to let her come along to Marcus's graduation trip to Orlando. "I won't take up much room," she'd said, standing in the kitchen doorway while her mother packed sunscreen into a suitcase. "I can share a bed with Marcus. I won't ask for souvenirs." Her mother had paused, hand on a bottle of sunscreen, and said, without looking up, "Baby, this trip is about your brother. He worked hard to get through school after everything he went through. This is his moment." "I work hard too," Myra had said quietly. "I know you do. And Aunt Odetta is expecting you Friday. She loves having you." That had been the whole conversation. No argument, no cruelty, just a quiet, absolute closing of a door over and over for 9 years, until Myra stopped knocking on it at all. She was still sitting on the bathroom floor when the dizziness finally passed. She stood on shaking legs, walked into her bedroom, and opened her closet. The same blue suitcase sat on the top shelf, faded now, one wool slightly bent. She pulled it down. She packed 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, her passport, and a manila folder holding 41 handwritten recipe cards in her aunt's slanted cursive. Bread, cakes, pastries, recipes Aunt Odetta had spent 30 years perfecting behind the counter of a bakery that never made her rich but had made her happy. Myra sat at her small dining table and picked up a pen. She stared at the blank paper for 4 full minutes before she wrote one sentence. "I'm safe. Please don't look for me." She dated it, folded it once, slid it beneath the ceramic sugar bowl her grandmother had left her, the only object in the apartment that felt like it belonged to someone who had chosen her. She did not call her mother. She did not call her father. She did not call Marcus. She sat down at her small dining table, laptop open, and typed her resignation email to the billing department where she'd worked for 4 years. She kept it short. Effective immediately. "Thank you for the opportunity." She did not explain herself. She had spent 27 years explaining herself to people who never once explained themselves back. Her coworker, Denise Palmer, a woman with the same first name as her mother, a coincidence Myra had always found faintly ironic, texted her the next morning asking if everything was okay. Myra typed back one line. "I'm finally choosing myself. I'll explain when I can." She never did explain, not fully, not for months, and by the time she did, it was in a much longer letter than she'd ever intended to write. She booked a one-way ticket to Seoul, South Korea, using savings she had built for a car she no longer wanted to buy, and by 6 the next morning, she was standing at Gate 14 of Charlotte Douglas International Airport with a suitcase, a folder of recipes, and no plan beyond landing somewhere no one had ever needed anything from her. On the 16-hour flight, she did not sleep. She watched the seatback map crawl across an ocean and let her mind drift backward through summers she had spent trying not to be a burden. She remembered her aunt's flour-dusted hands. She remembered the smell of cardamom bread rising at 5 in the morning. She remembered her aunt saying, "Baby, you are not extra. You hear me? You are not extra." She had never believed it. Not really. Not until the plane touched down in Incheon, and she stepped into a country where absolutely no one had ever met her, no one had ever compared her to her brother, and no one owed her 9 summers of silence. Seoul in early spring smelled like rain and roasted chestnuts. Myra stood outside the airport with her suitcase and realized, with a jolt that felt almost like laughter, that she had no idea what came next. At the gate, waiting to board, she pulled out her phone one last time and looked at a photo from 4 years earlier. Her and Aunt Odetta standing outside the Rock Hill Bakery, both of them covered in flour, both of them laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. It was the only photo on her phone that made her smile without effort. She turned the phone to airplane mode and put it away. She found a hostel near Hongdae for $18 a night. She spent the first week walking in circles, mispronouncing subway stops, and eating convenience store rice balls because she was too nervous to sit down in a real restaurant alone. She cried twice in the first 4 days, once on a bench near Han River and once in a shower stall the size of a phone booth. By the second week, her savings had shrunk to a number that frightened her. She walked past a small bakery on a quiet street in Yeonam-dong, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door, and the smell of baking bread stopped her cold on the sidewalk. It smelled exactly like her aunt's kitchen. She stood outside the window for 11 minutes before she worked up the courage to walk in. An elderly woman behind the counter looked up. Her name, stitched onto her apron, read Jang Haiwan. "Excuse me," Myra said slowly, holding up her phone with a translation app open. "Do you need help?" "I bake. I bake very well." Mrs. Jang studied her for a long moment, wiped flour from her hands onto her apron, and finally said in careful English, "You look tired. Sit. Eat first." Mrs. Jang set a small plate of red bean pastry in front of her before Myra could argue, then pulled up a stool and sat across from her, studying her the way a woman studies a stray animal, deciding whether to trust it. "Where is your family?" Mrs. Jang asked, in slow, careful English. "America," Myra said. "North Carolina. They know you are here." Myra shook her head. "Mrs. Jang nodded slowly, as though this answered a question larger than the one she'd asked. "My daughter live in Busan. We do not talk. Sometimes family is far even when they live one train away." She pushed the plate closer to Myra. "Eat. Then we talk about work." That was the first kindness Myra had received in 3 weeks, and she nearly cried again, this time from relief instead of grief. She stood outside the bakery that evening after her first unofficial shift, holding a small paper bag of unsold pastries Mrs. Jang had pressed into her hands, and asked herself the question that would end Act 1 of her life and begin something she never expected. Did I just make the biggest mistake of my life? Or did I finally do the one thing I should have done 9 years ago? She did not know the answer yet. But for the first time since she was 8 years old, nobody was waiting for her to disappear quietly into someone else's story. Mrs. Jang hired Myra properly within a week, paying her under the table in cash until her visa paperwork cleared through a lawyer Mrs. Jang's nephew knew. Myra worked 6 days a week, 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, kneading dough, boxing pastries, and slowly learning enough Korean to survive a transaction without her translation app. She was terrible at first. She burned a tray of milk bread her second week and nearly set off the smoke detector. On her 5th day, she confidently handed an elderly customer what she believed was a bag of sweet potato bread and had actually handed her 3 loaves of garlic baguette, a mistake that resulted in the woman returning 20 minutes later, quietly furious, speaking rapid Korean that Myra's translation app rendered as, roughly, "This is an outrage against bread itself." She mispronounced "thank you" so badly that a regular customer, a woman named Shin Yasul who worked at the flower shop next door, laughed so hard she had to sit down. "It's Gomawo," Yasul said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Not Gomawo. You're saying it like a cow." "I've been saying it like a cow for a week. Every single day." They became friends fast, the way 2 young women far from home tend to. Yasul was 24, sharp-tongued, and endlessly curious about America. Myra was 27, guarded, and endlessly grateful for someone who asked her questions without expecting anything from her in return. By her 3rd week, Myra had settled into a rhythm. Wake at 5. Walk to the bakery. Bake. Sell. Clean. Walk back to the small studio apartment she now rented above a laundromat. Repeat. She was standing behind the pastry display on a Thursday morning, rearranging a tray of cream buns, when the bell over the door rang and a man walked in wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He had the kind of face that made people in the shop go quiet without knowing why. He walked directly to the display case and stood in front of it, studying the pastries with an expression so serious he could have been reading a legal document. Myra waited. He did not move. A customer behind him, an older man with a cane, cleared his throat twice, trying to see past him. Myra set down her tongs. Sir, she said in English, since her Korean wasn't ready for confrontation yet, you're blocking the case. Some of us are trying to sell cakes back here. The man turned and looked at her the way someone looks at a bird that had just flown into their car window. Behind him, Mrs. Jang froze mid-sweep. Yesul, who had wandered in for her morning coffee, stopped chewing entirely. I was reading the labels, the man said in clean, unhurried English. You were standing in front of them for 4 minutes. Was I? You were. I counted. He glanced at the case again, then back at her, and something shifted behind his eyes, something like the beginning of a smile that never quite arrived. Which one would you recommend? Since you've clearly been keeping time. The cheesecake, she said. It's the only thing here that isn't trying too hard. He bought 2 slices of cheesecake and left without another word. The moment the bell over the door stopped ringing, Mrs. Jang set down her broom and walked over to Myra with an expression somewhere between horror and awe. Do you know who that was? She asked in Korean, which Yesul quickly translated. A rude customer who can't read a menu in under 30 seconds? That, Yesul said carefully, was Baek Tae-hyun. Myra blinked. Should that mean something to me? Yesul and Mrs. Jang exchanged a look that Myra would come to recognize over the following weeks. It was the look people gave each other right before explaining something they were afraid to say too loudly. He owns half the buildings on this street, Yesul said. And some people say he owns things you can't put a name on a building for. Myra shrugged and went back to her cream buns. She had left one country full of secrets and complicated men. She had no interest in decoding a second one. What she did not know, what no one in the bakery said out loud, because saying it out loud in Seoul carried its own kind of risk, was that Baek Tae-hyun was the head of the Baek family, an organization that controlled shipping routes, construction contracts, and 3 of the largest nightclubs in Gangnam, alongside businesses that never appeared on paper. Politicians returned his calls within the hour. Rival organizations avoided his territory the way sailors avoided a reef. Detectives who investigated his name tended to find their cases quietly reassigned. Detective Oh Young-won, 45 years old and 20 years into a career built on patience, once told a junior officer, "You do not go looking for Baek Tae-hyun. If he matters to your case, he will already know before you do." None of that mattered to Myra, because Myra did not know it existed. Tae-hyun returned to the bakery the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, his bodyguard, a broad-shouldered man named Kwon Sang-wook, had started parking the car half a block away instead of directly outside, because Tae-hyun insisted on walking the last stretch alone. He's never walked anywhere alone in 9 years, Sang-wook muttered to the second bodyguard, Yoon Dong-wook, from the driver's seat. Maybe he likes the cheesecake, Dong-wook said. Maybe, Sang-wook said, watching his boss disappear through the bakery door for the 6th morning in a row. He likes getting yelled at. Inside, Myra had no idea she was the subject of surveillance-adjacent gossip between 2 men who could, on any other Tuesday, end a business rival's career with a phone call. She simply noticed that the tall man in expensive coats kept showing up, kept ordering things he clearly didn't need, and kept losing every single argument she gave him. "You bought 4 croissants yesterday," she told him on his 7th visit. "You're one man. Who's eating all this?" "My security team." "Your security team eats croissants?" "They complain less when they're fed." "That's the smartest thing you've said all week." He almost smiled again. It kept happening. This almost smile that never fully arrived, like a door that opened 3 inches and stopped. Mrs. Jang watched this exchange from behind the register and said something in Korean that made Yesul choke on her coffee. "What did she say?" Myra asked. "She said," Yesul managed, "that you are the only person in Seoul brave enough to insult South Korea's most dangerous man over pastry, and you don't even know you're doing it." Myra glanced at the door Tae-hyun had just walked through, holding a paper bag with 4 croissants inside. "Dangerous," she repeated slowly. "He tips well, and he's polite to old ladies." He seems like a golden retriever in a suit. A golden retriever, Yesul said, does not make grown men afraid to say his name in restaurants. Myra laughed it off. She had left a country of people who scared her with silence, not violence, and she was not yet ready to understand that Seoul had its own version of the same wound, wearing a much more expensive coat. By late spring, Taehyun's visits had become the worst-kept secret on the block. The flower shop owner next door began timing her morning deliveries around them. The old man with the cane started arriving 15 minutes later just to watch. Myra noticed things about Taehyun that had nothing to do with his coat or his car. She noticed he never ordered food to eat there. He always took it to go, and she began to suspect he wasn't eating it at all, because on the mornings he lingered longer than usual. His hands looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with pastry. "You're not eating any of this, are you?" she said one morning, sliding a warm milk bread across the counter without charging him for it. "I eat. When—" He paused. "Later. Define later. Whenever the day allows it." She crossed her arms. "That's not an answer. That's an excuse with a tie on." He looked at her for a long moment, the almost smile arriving fully this time, cracking his whole face open in a way that made Mrs. Jang nearly drop a tray in the back room. "You're the only person who talks to me like that," he said. "Like what?" "Like a person and not a bank account." "Yes. Someone should have started years ago." He didn't answer that. He picked up the bread, thanked her in Korean, and left. Later that afternoon, Sang-wook found Taehyun standing in the parking garage beneath the Beck headquarters, staring at nothing in particular, the small paper bag from the bakery still in his hand. "Sir, the board meeting starts in 10 minutes. "I know. You've been standing here for 6 minutes. "I know that too." Taehyun finally looked up. "Sang-wook, has anyone ever spoken to you the way she speaks to me?" Sang-wook considered the question seriously, like a man who had, in fact, been quietly monitoring the entire situation for weeks. "No, sir. Most people are too afraid to speak to you at all." "It's strange," Taehyun admitted. "I keep waiting to feel annoyed by it." "I don't. With respect, sir, everyone in the building noticed that 3 months ago." But he came back the next day, and the day after, and by June, he had started arriving 20 minutes before the shop officially opened, standing outside in the cold so he could be first in line, which made no sense at all, since he could have simply had food delivered from anywhere in the city. Myra began saving him the good croissants, the ones baked slightly darker, the way Mrs. Jang liked them best, but customers usually passed over. She never told him she was doing it. He never mentioned that he noticed, but he always chose that one first. One morning, she caught him watching her hands as she shaped dough, his eyes following the motion the way someone studies something they're trying to memorize. "Careful," Mrs. Jang called from the back, not looking up from her ledger. "Flour is expensive. Do not waste it on a man who cannot even open a bag of it properly." "I heard that," Taehyun said. "You were meant to," Mrs. Jang replied, and Yesul, refilling the display case nearby, laughed so hard she nearly dropped a tray of scones. "You want to try?" Myra asked, holding out a lump of dough before she could think better of it. "I have people who bake for me." "That's not what I asked." He set down his coffee, removed his coat jacket, and rolled up his sleeves like a man preparing for a business negotiation instead of a lump of bread dough. What followed was, by Myra's account later to Yesul, an absolute disaster of historic proportions. He kneaded too hard. He added too much flour. He somehow got dough on the ceiling, a fact Mrs. Jang discovered 3 days later and refused to let anyone clean off, calling it evidence. Myra laughed until her stomach hurt, laughed the kind of laugh that came from somewhere old and buried, a laugh she hadn't produced since she was a child at her aunt's counter learning the same lessons. "You're supposed to be terrifying," she gasped, wiping flour off his sleeve. "This is the least terrifying thing I have ever witnessed." "I have a reputation to protect," he said, deadpan, dough stuck to his elbow. "Please don't tell anyone about this." Your secret's safe. Mostly because no one would believe me. It became a ritual. Once a week, usually Sunday morning before the shop opened to customers, he arrived early and attempted to bake something. He never improved much. He set off the fire alarm twice, trying to caramelize sugar, and once managed to fling an entire spoonful of batter onto Mrs. Jang's prized ceiling fan, which sprayed a fine mist of cake mix across the room every time it spun for the next 3 days. But each week, Myra found herself looking forward to Sundays in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in years. Between the flour and the failed loaves, they talked. He asked about her life in America, and she gave him pieces at first, a job she didn't love, an apartment no one visited, before she gave him the real story. 9 summers, she told him one Sunday, sitting on an overturned flour sack while he attempted, and failed, to shape a baguette. 9 summers my parents sent me away so they could take my brother on vacation. He had a childhood illness, recovered fully by the time he was 10. But they never stopped treating him like glass and me like furniture. Taehyun set down the dough. Furniture doesn't need anything. That's what they wanted from you. That's exactly what they wanted from me. Taehyun set the ruined baguette down entirely and looked at her, his full attention now, no trace of the almost smile left on his face. Furniture doesn't get scared. Furniture doesn't need anything. What did it cost you, being furniture for 9 years? Myra thought about it honestly, maybe for the first time out loud. It cost me believing I was allowed to want things. For a long time, I thought needing anything from anyone made me a burden. It took throwing up alone on a bathroom floor to realize that wasn't strength. It was just loneliness wearing a nicer word. And your aunt, the only person who ever chose me first. She taught me everything I know about bread and about being enough. He was quiet for a moment. My parents died when I was 25, he said finally. A car accident on the coast road outside Busan. I inherited the company 3 days after the funeral, before I had time to finish grieving. The bakery company? Not exactly. Something in his tone made her look up, but he had already moved past it. I inherited everything, he said. Every contract, every obligation, every enemy my father had made in 30 years. I was 25, and suddenly 300 employees were waiting for me to make decisions I had never been trained to make. That sounds lonely. It was. It is. He looked at the ruined dough in his hands. Everyone around me is loyal because they're paid to be, or afraid to be, or both. You're the first person in 9 years who talks to me because you want to, not because you need something. I do need something, Myra said deadpan. I need you to stop putting so much flour on my ceiling. He laughed, really laughed, the sound rough from disuse, and Mrs. Jang, listening from the back room, muttered something in Korean that Seoul later translated as, "That man has not laughed like that since I have known him, and I have known him 9 years." Weeks passed this way. Arguments over pastry became inside jokes. Inside jokes became long conversations that stretched past closing time. Myra found herself telling him things she had never said to anyone in Charlotte. How she used to sit in the airport parking lot and watch other families reunite, wondering what it felt like to be picked up by someone who missed you. He found himself telling her things his own bodyguards didn't know, that he sometimes wondered what his life would look like if his father had chosen a different business, a different legacy, a different set of debts to pass down. On a Sunday in late June, Taehyun arrived without his usual overcoat, dressed instead in a plain gray sweater that made him look, for once, like an ordinary man instead of a headline waiting to happen. "No dough today," he announced. "I've been informed by Mrs. Jang that I am, and I quote, a hazard to the ceiling. She's not wrong. Instead, I thought we could walk. If you're not busy." Myra untied her apron slower than necessary, buying herself a second to think. "Walk where?" "Han River. There's a spot near Mapo Bridge that isn't full of tourists yet. I want to show you something." They walked along the river as the afternoon lights softened into gold, past couples on rented bicycles and old men fishing off the concrete embankment. Taehyun walked with his hands in his pockets, and for the first time, Myra noticed he kept glancing sideways at her instead of scanning the crowd the way he usually did out of habit. "Tell me about your brother," he said eventually. "The one you mentioned." "Marcus." Myra exhaled slowly. "He was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 6. 2 years of chemo, a bone marrow transplant, the whole terrifying thing. He beat it. Fully. By the time he was 10, he was playing baseball again like nothing had happened. And your parents never stopped being afraid for him." "No. They built an entire family religion around not losing him again. And I understand it, Taehyun. I do. I was scared for him too. I just never understood why loving him meant forgetting I existed. You don't have to choose between loving someone and being loved back," Taehyun said quietly. "I spent years believing those were mutually exclusive. My father taught me that loyalty and love were the same transaction. They aren't." Myra looked at him for a long moment. "You talk like a man who's spent a lot of time alone with his thoughts." "I've had 9 years of practice." They stopped at a railing overlooking the water, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all, which somehow felt like the most honest conversation they'd had yet. The following Sunday, he took her to Gyeongbokgung Palace before it opened to tourists, using a connection Myra didn't ask questions about. They walked through empty stone courtyards while the morning fog still clung to the rooftops, and Myra found herself uncharacteristically quiet, tracing the carved eaves with her eyes. "It's strange," she said finally. "Standing somewhere this old makes me feel like my problems are smaller than I thought." "That's why I brought you here," Taehyun said. "When I was young, my father used to say that a man who understands how small he is in front of history makes better decisions than a man who doesn't." Did you believe him? "Not until I inherited everything he left behind. Now I understand exactly what he meant." She looked at him, the early light catching the sharp line of his jaw, and thought, not for the first time, that there was a gentleness in him nobody in Seoul seemed to believe existed. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "Nobody's ever shown me something just because they thought I'd like it, not without expecting something back." "I don't want anything back," Taehyun said. "I just wanted you to see something beautiful before the crowds arrived and ruined it." "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Then I clearly need to say nicer things more often." She laughed, and the sound echoed faintly against the old stone walls, and somewhere behind them, unseen, Sang-wook allowed himself the smallest smile, because in 9 years of service, he had never once heard his employer laugh so easily, so often, or so completely without calculation. Neither of them said the word love. Neither of them needed to. It sat quietly between the flour and the coffee and the Sunday mornings that had become the best hours of both their weeks, waiting for the moment they would finally have to name it. The truth arrived on a Tuesday in August, the way most truths do, without warning, without permission, and without the courtesy of good timing. Myra had stayed late to help Mrs. Jang restock flour after closing. She left through the back alley just after 9, the same alley she'd walked 100 times, when she heard tires screech at the mouth of the street. She turned in time to see a black car swerve to a stop and 2 men in dark jackets step out, one of them raising something that caught the streetlight in a way that made her stomach drop before her mind even processed the word gun. Taehyun had been walking toward the bakery, alone except for Sang-wook trailing a few paces behind, when the first shot cracked against the brick wall a foot from his shoulder. What happened next took 11 seconds, though Myra would later swear it felt like 11 minutes. Sang-wook moved first, tackling one gunman before he could steady his aim. Taehyun moved second, and what Myra saw in those seconds erased every soft, flour-dusted image she had built of him over 3 months. He disarmed the second man with a speed and a precision that had nothing to do with luck. He did not look afraid. He did not look surprised. He looked, for one terrible moment, like a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Dong-wook arrived from the parked car seconds later, and within a minute, both gunmen were on the ground, restrained, and Taehyun was standing in the middle of the alley straightening his coat sleeve like a man who had simply been caught in unexpected rain. Myra stood frozen against the brick wall, one hand pressed to her mouth. He saw her. For the first time since she'd met him, Taehyun looked afraid. "Myra, what is happening?" she said, her voice shaking. "What is this? What are you?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence told her everything the truth would later confirm. Yesul found her an hour later sitting on the curb 3 blocks from the bakery, and it was Yesul, gently, who finally said the words out loud. He runs the Beck organization, not just the buildings, not just the clubs, everything underneath them too. "You knew," Myra said. "You knew this whole time. Everyone in Seoul knows, Myra. I thought you understood and just didn't care. I didn't know because nobody told me. Would you have believed us if we did? You called him a golden retriever in a suit." Myra put her head in her hands. She did not go to the bakery for 4 days. Taehyun did not chase her. He did not send flowers, did not send money, did not send Sangwook to knock on her door with an explanation wrapped in threats disguised as concern. He waited, the way he had learned to wait for everything else in his life that mattered, quietly, and with the terrible patience of a man who understood that some things could not be forced. On the 5th day, Myra returned to the bakery, not because she had forgiven him, but because Mrs. Jang needed help and Myra had nowhere else that felt like home. Taehyun was there, sitting at the small table by the window where customers rarely sat, waiting like he had been waiting every morning she hadn't come. "I'm not asking you to accept it," he said before she could speak. "I'm asking for 5 minutes to explain why I never told you." She sat down across from him, arms crossed, jaw tight. "I didn't hide it because I wanted to deceive you," he said. "I hid it because for 3 months, someone spoke to me like I was simply a man, not an empire, not a threat, not a name people whisper in hallways. A man who burns bread and gets yelled at over cheesecake. I wanted that to last as long as it could before you looked at me the way everyone else does. How does everyone else look at you? Like I might be the reason their brother disappeared, or their business failed, or their name ended up on a list somewhere." He exhaled slowly. "I never asked to inherit any of it, but I did inherit it, and I can't hand it back like a lump of bad dough." Myra stared at the table for a long time. "I left home," she said finally, "because I was tired of people deciding what I could handle without asking me first. My parents decided I was strong enough to be left behind. You decided I was fragile enough to be lied to. Neither of those things is what I wanted." "You're right," Taehyun said. "I should have told you. I was wrong to wait." "Yes, you were. I'm not going to ask you to be part of that world. I never wanted that for you." "That's not your choice to make either," Myra said. "If I decide to stay, I decide what I can carry. Not you. Not my parents. Me." For the first time since the alley, Taehyun's shoulders loosened. "Then decide," he said quietly. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Myra was quiet for a long moment, watching flower dust settle in a stray beam of afternoon light. "I need time," she said. "Not forever. Just time. Take it." During those 3 weeks, Myra called Aunt Odetta for the first time since leaving Charlotte, sitting on the floor of her small studio apartment with her back against the bed frame. "Aunt Odetta, it's me." There was a long pause, then a sound that might have been a sob and might have been a laugh. "Lord have mercy, girl. I have been praying over that empty chair at my kitchen table every single morning." Myra told her everything. The bakery, Mrs. Jang, Taehyun, the alley, the gunman, the truth. Her aunt was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "Baby, let me ask you something plain. Does this man make you feel like furniture, or does he make you feel like somebody worth choosing?" "The second one," Myra admitted. "Every single day." "Then that's your answer." "It was never about the danger, Myra. It's about whether somebody sees you. You spent 9 summers with people who didn't. Don't run from the one person who finally does, just because the truth showed up scarier than you expected." Myra wiped her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "Around the same time you were 8 years old," and I decided I'd rather teach a little girl to bake bread than let her believe nobody wanted her around. She took 3 weeks. In that time, Taehyun did not disappear from her life entirely. He still came for his usual croissant, still sat at his usual table, still lost every small argument she gave him. But he stopped pushing for more than she offered, and something about that restraint told her more about his character than any explanation could have. Meanwhile, in rooms Myra never saw, a rival organization run by a man named Nam Seongmin began circulating a different kind of rumor, that Baek Taehyun had a weakness now, a woman with no protection and no understanding of the world she'd wandered into. Seongmin, 40 years old, ran a smaller but ambitious network out of Incheon and had spent 3 years watching for any crack in the Baek organization's foundation. He sat in his office on the 40th floor of a building he owned outright, turning a photograph of Myra over in his fingers, one his men had taken outside the bakery. An American, he said, almost amused. No family here. No security training. No idea what she's walked into. She works at a bakery in Yeonam-dong, one of his men reported. No bodyguards visible until 3 weeks ago. Find out who she is, Seongmin told his men. A man who loves something can be made to bleed through it. Taehyun has survived every direct attack we've tried for 2 years because he protects nothing but himself. Now he protects something else. That's the opening we've been waiting for. Taehyun heard about the rumor within 2 days, the way he heard about everything eventually. He said nothing to Myra about it, not because he was hiding it again, but because he had already quietly doubled her security without her knowledge, moved through Sangwook and paid for by an account she would never see a statement from. He was not going to lose her to his silence twice. By the end of the 3rd week, Myra walked into the bakery on a quiet Sunday morning, sat across from him at the small table by the window, and said, "I'm staying. Not because you're powerful, not because you're wealthy, because you're the only person who's ever let me decide anything for myself." Taehyun reached across the table and took her hand, carefully, like something he still couldn't quite believe was real. "Then let's decide together," he said. "Starting now." 14 months after Myra Sears disappeared from Charlotte, North Carolina, her mother, Denise, sat in a hospital waiting room reading a text message from a private investigator she had hired 4 months earlier. Confirmed location, Seoul, South Korea. Employed at a bakery in Yeonam-dong. Appears to be in a relationship with a high-profile local businessman. Denise showed the message to her husband, Robert, who read it twice before setting the phone down on his knee. "A businessman," he repeated. "In Korea. That doesn't matter right now," Denise said. "What matters is she's alive, she's stable, and we need her." Robert's father, Myra's grandfather, had passed 2 years earlier, leaving behind medical debt no one had planned for. Marcus, now 31, had spiraled through 2 failed businesses and a divorce, and had recently moved back into his parents' house, unemployed and unraveling. Robert himself had been diagnosed with early heart failure 6 months prior, requiring care neither he nor Denise could afford alone. They needed help. They needed, specifically, the daughter they had spent 9 summers training to need nothing. They booked flights to Seoul within the week. Myra was standing behind the counter of the bakery, now working there full-time as Mrs. Jang's official second-in-command. When the bell over the door rang, and she looked up to see her parents standing in the doorway, older than she remembered, smaller somehow, staring at her like she was a stranger wearing their daughter's face. "Myra," her mother said, voice cracking. Myra did not drop the tray she was holding. She did not run into anyone's arms. She set the tray down carefully on the counter and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, "How did you find me?" "We hired someone," her father admitted. "We needed to find you." "You needed to find me," Myra repeated. "Not wanted. Needed." Her parents exchanged a glance that told her everything before her mother even spoke. "Your grandfather's medical bills nearly wiped us out," Denise said. "Your father's heart isn't what it used to be." "Marcus is," Marcus is struggling, Myra. We need you to come home. There it was. The same sentence, dressed in 14 months and 6,000 miles. But exactly the same sentence she had heard her entire childhood. We need you to give something up so someone else can be okay. Myra felt Taehyun's presence before she saw him, stepping quietly through the door behind her parents. Sangwook a respectful distance back. He did not speak. He did not step forward. He simply stood near the wall, letting her know without a single word that he was there if she needed him, and that this was, entirely, her battle to fight. Her parents noticed him immediately, noticed the quality of his coat, the way Sangwook stood at parade rest by the door, the unmistakable air of a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. Who is that? Robert asked quietly. Someone who's never once asked me to disappear for his comfort, Myra said. She turned back to her parents, and for the first time in her life, she did not lower her eyes. I'm not coming home, she said. Not to live there. Not to fix what you built without me. Myra, please. I spent 9 summers in Ann Odetta's bakery because you decided Marcus's recovery mattered more than my childhood. I understood it when I was 8 because I didn't know better. I understood it when I was 16 because I was scared to lose you completely. I don't understand it anymore, and I won't pretend to. We were trying to keep him alive, her mother said, tears gathering. I know, and I'm glad he lived. But keeping him alive didn't require erasing me every summer for 9 years. You could have chosen both of us. You chose him every single time, and you called it strength when I stopped asking why. The bakery had gone quiet. Mrs. Jang had stopped sweeping. Yesul stood frozen by the register, translating nothing, needing to translate nothing, because grief sounds the same in every language. I will help, Myra said finally, her voice softening slightly. I'll arrange proper care for Grandpa's remaining bills. I'll help pay for a home health aide for Dad. I'll help Marcus find a real program, not a loan he can't repay. But I will not move back to Charlotte, and I will not spend the rest of my life being the family's emergency fund with a heartbeat. And him? Her father asked, glancing toward Taehyun. Is this permanent? Are you sure about this life? Myra looked at Taehyun, who met her eyes steadily, offering nothing but presence, no pressure, no opinion forced into her mouth. I'm sure about him, Myra said. I'm still learning about everything that comes with him. But he's never once asked me to be smaller so someone else could be bigger. That's more than I can say about the family I grew up in. Her mother wept quietly into a tissue. Her father stared at the floor. Neither of them argued further, because there was, for the first time in Myra's life, nothing left to argue. That evening, Myra's phone rang. Marcus's name lit up the screen, and she almost let it go to voicemail before deciding, finally, that she owed herself the closure of hearing him say something directly instead of always through their parents. Myra. His voice sounded rougher than she remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with distance. Mom told me what you said to them, and I guess I never thought about it like that. Like you were the one who got left behind. 9 summers, Marcus. You were there for all of them. You never once asked where I was. There was a long silence on the line. I was a kid, Myra. I didn't know how to ask. And then I got older, and it just felt normal, you not being there. I'm not proud of that. I'm not asking you to be proud of it. I'm asking you to understand that it happened, and it cost me something you never had to pay. I hear you, Marcus said quietly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I should have noticed sooner. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the apology she'd imagined at 8 years old, sitting on her aunt's porch step watching a car disappear down the driveway. But it was real, and after 27 years of silence, real was enough to build on. Before they left 3 days later, Myra sat with her mother alone at a small cafe near their hotel and said the thing she had never said out loud in 27 years. I needed you to choose me sometimes. Not always. Just sometimes. That's all I ever wanted. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand, and for once, did not offer an excuse in return. I know, Denise said quietly. I know that now. I'm sorry it took losing you to understand it. It wasn't a full repair. Some wounds don't close just because someone finally says sorry. But it was a beginning, built on Myra's terms instead of anyone else's convenience. And for Myra, that was enough. 6 weeks after her parents returned to America, Taehyun asked Myra to close the bakery early on a Sunday, claiming he needed to speak with Mrs. Jang about a delivery matter. There was no delivery matter. When Myra walked out from the back room, the bakery had been transformed, not with extravagance, but with warmth. Strings of small paper lanterns hung from the ceiling beams. The display case had been cleared and replaced with a single tray of cheesecake, the exact slice she had recommended to him the very first day they met. Mrs. Jang stood by the register, dabbing her eyes with her apron. Yesul stood beside her, grinning so widely her cheeks must have hurt. Taehyun stood in the center of the room in a simple gray suit. No bodyguards visible, no cameras, no reporters, nothing but bread, sunlight through the front window, and the woman who had once told him he was blocking the display case. You once told me the cheesecake was the only thing here that wasn't trying too hard, he said, his voice steadier than she'd ever heard it, though his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady at all. I've spent a year trying not to try too hard either. Trying to be someone you'd choose, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You've succeeded, Myra said, her own voice catching. I'm not finished. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box. I don't have a kingdom to offer you that you'd want. I don't have vacations or reputation or safety in the way most people measure it. What I have is this bakery, on the morning we met, and everything true that happened after it. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never again wonder whether you're someone's first choice. He opened the box. Myra pressed a hand to her mouth. Myra, sirs, he said, will you marry me? Yes, she said, before he'd even fully lowered to one knee. And the bakery erupted into a noise that included Mrs. Jang's sobbing, Yesul's shrieking, and, from just outside the door, where Sangwook and Dongwook had been listening the entire time despite strict instructions not to, the unmistakable sound of two grown bodyguards trying and failing not to cry. Were you crying? Myra asked Sangwook later, laughing. Absolutely not, Sangwook said, wiping his eyes. He was sobbing, Dongwook said. I have it on my phone. Delete that immediately, Sangwook said. The night before the wedding, Taehyun's small circle gathered at the bakery for a quiet dinner. No cameras, no press, just Mrs. Jang's cooking, Sangwook and Dongwook arguing over who would give the better toast, and Aunt Odetta holding court at the head of the table like she'd known everyone there for years instead of 2 days. I want to say something, Sangwook announced, standing with a glass of soju raised unsteadily. For 9 years I have protected this man from bullets, lawsuits, and one extremely persistent tax auditor. I never thought I would need to protect him from a woman with a rolling pin. To the rolling pin, Dongwook said, raising his own glass, which succeeded where an entire security detail failed. Taehyun laughed harder than he had in years, and across the table, Myra caught Mrs. Jang wiping her eyes again, muttering something about how she'd never expected her little bakery to become the site of so much happiness. Their wedding took place the following afternoon in a garden ceremony outside Seoul that blended traditions from both of their worlds. A Korean piebeek followed the American vows. Myra dressed first in white, then in a hanbok Mrs. Jang had helped her choose, embroidered with small wheat stalks along the hem, a quiet tribute to the bakery where everything had started. The centerpiece of the reception was not flowers. It was bread, loaves shaped from Aunt Odetta's 41 recipe cards, baked by Myra herself the night before with Mrs. Jang and Yesul at her side, arranged on long tables beneath string lights. Myra had flown Aunt Odetta out for the wedding, and it was Aunt Odetta, 71 years old and dressed in her Sunday best, who stood to give the toast. I've watched this girl grow up believing she was extra, Aunt Odetta said, her voice thick with feeling. I want everyone here to know she was never extra. She was the finest thing that ever walked into my kitchen, and now she's the finest thing that ever walked into this one." She raised her glass toward Taehyun. "You take care of my girl." "I intend to," Taehyun said, "for the rest of my life." Sangwook cried again. Dongwook filmed it again. Neither of them denied it this time. Later that evening, once most of the guests had gone and only the string lights and the smell of leftover bread remained, Myra found her father standing alone near the dessert table, staring at a photograph display Mrs. Jang had assembled. Pictures from the year: Myra kneading dough, Taehyun covered in flour, the two of them laughing outside the bakery window. "You built a whole life we knew nothing about," her father said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. "I built a whole life because the one I had didn't leave room for me," Myra said, gentler than she might have been a year earlier. "I don't say that to hurt you anymore, Dad. I say it because it's just true." Her father nodded slowly, his hand resting against his chest for a moment, an old habit since his diagnosis. "I'm glad you found people who see you the way you deserve to be seen all along. I wish I'd been one of them." "You still can be," Myra said. "Just not by needing me. By choosing me. There's a difference." Her father looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "I'll try," he said. "That's the best I can promise." "That's all I'm asking," Myra said. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it without any bitterness left in her voice at all. 6 years later, a house overlooking the Han River echoed most mornings with the particular chaos only small children could produce: the thunder of feet on hardwood, the shriek of a sibling squabble over a missing toy, the low, patient voice of a father who somehow never seemed to raise his own. Myra Sersbeck stood in the front hallway every summer morning before a family trip, counting. 1, 2, 3. She counted the children, a set of 6-year-old twins, Ariam and Jinho, and a 4-year-old daughter, Somi, and then, without fail, counted them again, and sometimes a third time, before she would allow anyone to walk toward the car. It took years before anyone in the household noticed the pattern enough to ask about it. It was Ariam, 6 years old and sharp-eyed like her mother, who finally asked one summer morning while Myra counted for the second time, "Mommy, why do you always count us before we go anywhere?" Myra knelt down to her daughter's height. The old blue suitcase, the same one, faded and battered, now covered in colorful travel stickers from 4 continents, and a small handprint Somi had left in fabric paint the year before, sitting by the front door. "Because a long time ago," Myra said gently, "I used to watch a family drive away without me. And I promised myself that in our family, nobody ever gets left behind. Not once. Not ever." Jinho, Ariam's twin, wandered over dragging a small backpack twice his size. "Did you count me yet?" "3 times," Myra said, smoothing his hair. "You're accounted for." "Good," Jinho said matter-of-factly. "Because I would be very upset if we left without me." "That," Taehyun said from the doorway, "is exactly the point, little man." Somi, 4 years old and clutching a stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to Ariam, toddled over and wrapped both arms around Myra's leg. "Count me, Mommy." "I already did, baby. Twice." "Do it again." Myra laughed and scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "One, Somi. Present and accounted for and absolutely not getting left behind." Ariam considered all of this with the serious concentration only a 6-year-old can produce. "So you count us because you love us. I count you because I never want any of you to wonder if you're wanted. Not for one single second." Taehyun appeared in the doorway, watching the exchange with the same expression he'd worn the first morning he stood too long in front of a pastry case, quiet, unhurried, and entirely certain of exactly where he wanted to be. "Everyone accounted for?" he asked, the corner of his mouth lifting into the smile that had taken a year to fully arrive and had never once left since. "3 for 3, Myra said, standing and taking Somi's small hand in hers. They loaded the old blue suitcase into the car, alongside three smaller ones covered in the same stickers, and pulled out of the driveway toward the airport, toward a vacation no child in that car would ever spend wondering why they hadn't been invited. That evening, after the children were finally settled at their aunt's beach house the family rented every July, a small tradition Myra had started the year the twins turned 3, choosing a quiet coastline instead of anything flashy. Taehyun found Myra standing on the back porch, watching the last of the light fade over the water. "You still do it every time," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The counting. I don't think I'll ever stop." "I know." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I used to think love meant surviving whatever your family handed you without complaint. You taught me it means building something better than what you were handed, on purpose, every single day." "You taught me something too," Myra said, leaning into him. "You taught me that being chosen isn't about being rescued. It's about someone deciding, over and over, that you're worth staying for." Inside, through the screen door, they could hear Jinho arguing with Ariam over whose turn it was to hold the stuffed rabbit, and Somi's small, delighted laugh rising above both of them. And for a moment, neither Myra nor Taehyun moved, content simply to stand there and listen to the sound of a family that would never once wonder if it had been left behind. Myra Surs had spent 9 summers believing she came second. She built a family, one flower-dusted argument and one honest conversation at a time, where no one ever came second again. And every summer, before the plane left the ground, she counted them. Once, twice, sometimes 3 times, not out of fear, but out of a promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life. Because the greatest revenge, she had learned, was never making the people who hurt her suffer. It was building, with her own 2 hands, the exact thing they had once convinced her she would never deserve.